even when we're spending billions of pounds, our tools just aren't good enough. It came to me talking through to the Prime Minister about why the UK strategy was wrong, and the tool I used was a whiteboard. Synthetic audience is essentially a model of your audience you can experiment with in electric twins, so you can build confidence faster, at lower cost, at a higher speed. In some ways you spend as much time, if not more time, with your co-founder than you spend with your wife. We are both constantly succeeding and constantly failing in electric twin at the same time. I think that sometimes we talk about failure as though failures are good. Failures are never good.
Welcome to yet another episode of LightbuLBS. Today, we are joined by Ben Warner. He's the co-founder of Electric Twin, a company building in the exciting space of synthetic audiences. With a master's and a PhD in physics, Ben's experience spans across data and the UK civil service, where he was the chief advisor to the UK Prime Minister during the COVID-19 pandemic. And now with Electric Twin, he's working at the intersection of design, simulation, and digital infrastructure. In today's conversation, Ben, we really want to unpack and understand everything about your journey from idea to execution, what it is like to build a new category, and what it's like to take a business from scratch to building and to reaching the success where you are. So welcome to LightbuLBS.
Thank you so much for having me.
Getting started, I briefly mentioned about your background, but I'd really appreciate if you could run us through the key experiences that you've had and, more specifically, the aha moment that led you to Electric Twin and how you went across and started the entire business.
Yeah, so I was actually a physicist, as you mentioned, to do my PhD, but I was actually a research fellow at UCL, so just down the road. And I was planning to go to the States to do a postdoc looking into quantum computing. And at this point, my brother had just started a company that then called ASI Data Science, now called Faculty, which is actually just sold to Accenture as a unicorn. And he was like, look, I think you should learn some machine learning and AI. It will help your physics career. And I thought, that's a great thing. While the grant application process is going on, I went down to learn about machine learning, and I just never went back to the lab. Just turned out I loved the real world problems more than I loved physics. So then I worked at Faculty for a number of years, initially as a data scientist and then sort of leading teams, really around two things. One, around helping organizations to sort of innovate around how they use AI. And secondly, and often in combination, around using AI to try and understand populations and understand how they might be able to, you build out better campaigns, influence them, etc. I then actually left Faculty to go work in polling for a company called Hanbury Strategy. And then that was really to show that some of the ideas that we developed in Electric Twin around understanding audiences were sort of better than the convention. And actually, we were the most accurate pollster of that round. And then I was asked to join Number 10 as chief advisor to the Prime Minister. Though I will confess, I didn't know that title till I was actually leaving, which is a story in itself. So I joined just after December 2019. And so if we move forward very shortly, we get to February and March 2020, which for most people here, they will have hoped to have forgotten those times around COVID. And I think the really interesting thing about COVID is that I think everyone imagines that, at the heart of government, we're making these £1 billion decisions, that there would be like this Minority Report style dashboard with all the data, all the models. And I think people sometimes believe that maybe that doesn't exist in government, but it exists in Google or it exists in Facebook or Palantir or maybe McKinsey or BCG, whatever you think. Now, it doesn't exist in those because we actually got them into Number 10 and we got the Prime Minister to ask them and say, if you've got these models, we need them to help us make the decision. It came to me talking through to the Prime Minister about why the UK strategy was wrong and we had to change strategy. The tool I used was a whiteboard. And so when we sort of think about sort of like, you mentioned the aha moment of Electric Twin, I went, aha makes it sound like a eureka, like an excitement motor, rather than just, in government that time, we were trying our best to build out policies that had the largest possible impact on the spread of disease and the lowest possible impact on harms of people, whether that's mental health, other health benefits, economic, etc. And we couldn't do that because we couldn't predict human behaviour. We couldn't understand how people would react to the policies or build out the policies we needed. So on leaving Number 10, I was just trying to work out ways that we could do that better. How could we build tools that help decision makers better around understanding audiences? And so that's really where Electric Twin comes from, those experiences and realizing that even at that top level, even when we're spending billions of pounds, our tools just aren't good enough.
Right, understood. So, That is honestly, I feel, the best way you find an idea as well, or you uncover a problem through experience, which is what I understand happened with you as well. You worked with the government, you saw a problem in, let's say, data, a lack of data, to take very large scale decisions that are impacting a lot of people. So you did not just have entrepreneurship as a plan at all, but it's just something you stumbled across through your experiences. So looking back, what do you think were the major skills that, gave you a very invaluable advantage when you were just starting out Electric Twin, right? Leaving the government, now you're starting out Electric Twin. What is something that gave you a very big unfair advantage?
I think that you can look back at the different parts of my career, and each of them very much helps. The physics career of learning to sort of learn how to, think, to solve complex problems, but also just things around like understanding how, you just get mistakes wrong. How do you deal with uncertainty around experiments that don't work? Then into faculty, that gives me experience of learning what it's like to be in an early stage startup. I think that type of experience is invaluable, seeing what it's like to go through that journey, learning some of the ups and downs, learning from the mistakes that others made. And then obviously number 10, a really interesting perspective, as you just described. It also means that you build out networks of people you can rely on through the way. So I think all those factors together give me an unfair advantage.
Right. Understood. You also said that experiments that did not work, or strategies that you probably took did not work out, were also a very good learning point for you when you're starting out Electric Twin. Can you share about a particular experience like that, something that did not work out like you had thought it would, which really helped you in the long run?
So it's hard to describe, because I think that sometimes we talk about failure as though failures are good. Failures are never good. The way I would say it is, what you're trying to do is you're trying to always pick paths where no matter what the branch ends up, the reality of the world is, it is a success. You want to think it's not a casino where, you put your chips on red, and if it comes up black, you lose. Actually, what you want to put your chips on is that, okay, if it lands on red, we're going this way. If it lands on black, it goes this way. And so that's the way that we're always trying to think about it in Electric Twin. We're always trying to think about, given the resources that we're trying to apply, and the feedback we're getting from the world, what decisions should we make? And then how do we best make the most of whatever that real world feedback is? So in some ways, like, we're both constantly succeeding and constantly failing in Electric Twin at the same time. And I think that experimental mindset, and actually that's what an experimental mindset looks like. Whereas I think sometimes there's a sort of cliche of, oh, his big failures are good. They're not, obviously not.
Exactly.
And so actually what you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize the costs that you're paying and maximize the upsides. You're always trying to make the best asymmetrical, if you will.
Right. That's a very unique perspective to look at things, experimental designs. Each outcome that can happen has some benefits for us. That's a very good way of thinking when you are building out startups. Now, just coming to Electric Twin, I understand that you're building synthetic audiences for the companies today. But for people who do not know what synthetic audiences are, how would you, explain it simply in a very simple language?
Yeah, so a synthetic audience is essentially a model of your audience that when you ask it a question, it gives the same response as that audience would give if you ask that audience in the real world.
Okay. So essentially, if I'm a company today and let's say I want to roll out a new product, instead of rolling out the new product in the real world, I first roll it out with Electric Twin and the audience who build for me. And based on the insights and the reactions they give me, I make product changes, I make positioning changes.
Yeah, exactly. But you can start much more like earlier than that, when you're thinking about understanding your customers, understanding the audience, the problems they have. Then you start thinking about, okay, what might it look like? What propositions might be? What might my product look like? How do we message it? How do our customers think of our competitors? All those constant decisions you can experiment with in Electric Twin, so you can build confidence faster, at lower cost, at higher speed.
That is mind blowing. And I feel this is a new sector or a new industry that's been created right now. And, from what I personally feel, is that building trust in a new category is probably the biggest challenge that you might have also faced. Correct me if I'm wrong.
We do face. I wouldn't have said we have faced. I think it's very much a present tense problem for us
Yeah.
as well.
Okay, so how do you tackle this problem of trust? Because we've got so many people in our community, in our LBS student community itself, for trying to build something new. And what they struggle with the most is how do we convince people of the product that we are building? So how do you build that trust factor?
I'm not going to pretend that I've got the sort of magic one, because I think it's hard, and I think it likely depends on the type of product you're building and the costs to the company of trying your product. For us, I think that it's really important that every touch point in the customer interaction, that they see somebody who genuinely cares both about the customer's problems, understands that customer's problems, and then can explain how Electric Twin can help solve that, and how we verify that we can actually do what we do. So when we make a claim, we need to be able to show the evidence. And for some people, the best evidence is the customers that are using it. Every day customers are using our tools to make decisions. And that to them is the best evidence. For other people, that what they want to see is the pre-registered studies, the work we're doing with the London School of Economics, to validate all our research. But fundamentally, for every customer, what they want is that trust. Because I think that it is very easy to get caught up in the sort of fake it till you make it style, the sort of overpromise. But for me, the thing you have to remember is, if you overpromise, you sell to a customer who believes that, and then that customer you can't deliver, that customer is burnt inside. That customer loses out in different ways. So although you as a business might, you carry on, and actually for that customer, that's sort of not the best way to do it. And so I think you have to be really cautious of that, because actually for early stage startups, the most valuable thing are those other customers. They are precious beyond measure. We've been lucky enough that the Times newspaper has worked with us from early days, and their input, the feedback to us, has been probably the most valuable thing for building a product. So I think that, being very, very, very aware that you're handling the most precious resource of a startup in those early customers, I think that both helps you build trust, but then also helps you make the most of that really valuable resource.
Right. So evidence focused, customer focus, and under promise and over deliver.
I think promise truthfully. That does not mean, I think it's really important. Like, I think that the way I think about it is that you're looking across the table to somebody you're trying to have a win-win conversation with a trusted partner. That doesn't mean under promise or over promise. That means that you're having a high bit and breadth conversation, but making sure it's valuable for them, right? That's the key thing. It's got to be valuable for them.
Right. Understood. One of the key things that we've also seen is that startups, when they come up, they become very different by the time they're launched into the market. Was that the case with Electric Twin as well? And if yes, like, what did the first earliest versions of Electric Twin look like?
So, well, the first experiments that I ran were just hacky Python code. Because really what the first stage was, back in the day, this seemed like a really crazy idea. And so, when I'm experimenting on GPT-3, did it work? And the answer is not really. 3.5, it started working, that built confidence. Actually, I built the first version of the prototype, and until quite recently, actually, it looked quite a lot like what I initially designed. Or actually, let's say there's different. The second version I designed, there was actually 2 prototypes. I think the reason for that, though, is because for some startups who are trying to solve a new problem, whereas we are actually, in some ways, we know what the problem is. We can see it every day because insight agencies are carrying it out, management consultancies are coming out, internal teams are carrying it out. So that workflow that we are looking to interact with and exist with does already exist. So we can sort of copy that. So that allows us to get to a certain level. And it's at this point, actually, now I think we've reached the point where the prototype and the product actually are starting to differentiate quite a lot. And that's due to sort of customer feedback, actually interacting with these tools and seeing how people want to use it. Now that they get comfortable with this slightly different workflow that AI allows, how they want to be able to exploit that.
Right. Like you said, so you had a base workflow in mind through the real world examples that you had, and then through customer feedback, through your own intuition, through all the research that you've done, you started building on those base levels. But let's say for a startup who cannot find, right, a base workflow equivalent, what would a process look like for that person? Because a lot of time what happens is that you keep on iterating on your product over and over again. You cannot seem to finalize what your end product would look like. And in this process, a lot of people drop out of entrepreneurship thinking this might not work out. What would your thoughts be on that?
So most people's advice is always, you should get into the customer's hands as early as possible. You should try and solve things as early as possible. And there's lots of people who will give you probably better advice than I will on that, because I've only started one startup, and obviously, as I said, it's sort of like we have this cheat code that exists. So the one advice I would always give people is small changes make small differences, big changes make big differences. So sometimes I think that people sort of like, they build something, it doesn't quite work. And so they iterate on the UI, or they iterate on, the small, if it's not working and you're early stage, what are the, sort of like that Toyota, think through the 5 whys. Right. What are the things? And then what is the thing you have to change? So I briefly mentioned the difference between the 2 prototypes. And the key change I made is that actually in the first prototype, it was done but the key change that really made it sort of pop was actually, it was about interaction. So people wanted to have an audience and an interaction. They wanted to interact with the audience rather than have a focus group and set things up like that. They wanted to be able to have a project, audience, interaction. And that sort of basic construct of audience, interaction, project is what has stayed true. So I had to rebuild the whole code base, because the code base to allow that looked very different to my initial idea. So I think if you are stuck, it doesn't mean you're wrong. Often it means you just have to, take 2 steps back and check your sort of basic underlying assumption. What's the crux of the problem? Once you understand the crux, then you can try and solve it.
Exactly. Take a couple of steps back and rethink, re-understand what you're solving, and then try to maybe go in a level further.
Yeah. Look for that big change. I mean, you're an early stage startup. You just got to be swinging the bat.
Exactly. That's true. Coming back to Electric Twin, how would you differentiate Electric Twin from other players in the market? Or even, let's say, a ChatGPT, where firms today can put in all the data about their consumers and then maybe ask for insights and recommendations or behavioral answers that a synthetic audience might give up.
Yeah, so I think we have to be really careful that we don't try and create a workplace assistant. ChatGPT, Claude, unbelievably useful workplace assistants. We use them all the time. Like, we have all our customer interviews so that we can interact with them in Claude Code. It pulls them out, it synthesizes, it summarizes. That is unbelievably powerful. If we try and compete with that, we will lose. So what we need to really fixate on, and what we're trying to do is work out how an audience would react to a specific question. That is not something that these workplace assistants can do. Actually, we can test and show that they give inaccurate answers. How we differentiate ourselves from the competition is really accuracy and trust. We use real world data, so we don't believe this idea that you can just pull data out of the sort of ether, the audience out of the ether of the LLM, and give an accurate response. We think that you need to use real world data with these models in actually a combination. It's quite a complex engine now to get the accuracy that we get. And then we need to be able to verify, like I said at the start, that you get basically the same answers as you get with traditional methodology. And then we need to put that in a software product where it is really accessible for people, and it gives them actionable results. So that combination of accuracy, actionability, and accessibility, I think, are really core to what we're trying to drive with Electric Twin. And that's sort of how we do it. So far, that seems to be working quite well.
Right. And talking a bit more about the industry, what are the biggest opportunities that you think are there in the next 2 to 3 years? And you mentioned like ChatGPT and Claude and how you're different from them. But who would you say are your biggest competitors? Are these the startups that are coming up right now, or big scale marketing agencies, or let's say Google or Meta, workplaces that are coming or that are investing a lot in AI based recommendations for businesses? Are these your competitors?
Yeah, I think the way you've said it there is really nice. There's the big platform companies like Google, Meta. There's the big holding companies at WPP,
Right.
and companies like that. There's other synthetic startups, and then there's consultancies and traditional. All of those, I think, are in some ways our competition. Some of them, I think, are not actually as competitive as you'd think. That other providers, right? I think it's such a an opportunity. There's space for everyone. Everyone's sort of finding their own sort of location within that. Some will win out, some will, and over time we'll see who, there'll be power law returns. But right now, I think there's so much space, we don't really bump into each other. To be honest with you, our biggest competition is to do nothing. The question that you asked around why trust is so important is because if you're sitting there, actually most decisions in a business, nobody has any feedback. Imagine if you had the ability to very quickly test with your audience what they most care about asking me questions, but you don't, because that's very hard, it's very expensive, it's very slow. So almost every decision in a business doesn't have market research. And so actually for us, if you think of the tiny amount of area where we have really good data, ready information, and we are interested, we do compete in this area. But if you think about the vast swathe of where there is basically people making their best possible guess because usually it's too expensive or it's too slow or it doesn't provide them with an actionable enough answer or they can't access the data, that's actually where I think the huge opportunity lies. So really our competition is inaction.
Right. Well, that that is exciting to hear. Just moving forward towards team building at Electric Twin. This is one of the I'd say hot topics for LBS students as well. We've got a lot of students who are now, working to build their own startups. And one thing they really struggle with is finding the right co-founder for them. And I know that you and your co-founder go a way back. So how did you find your co-founder? What were some things that you looked at maybe in deciding who you could, partner up with and who you
Yeah.
could build a team with?
So for me, so I met my co-founder March the 16th, just outside the cabinet room because he was drafted in it. He was requested to, come into number 10 to help with the COVID effort when we realized that everything was sort of going up the creek, shall we say. And he is a superb operator, 20 years of experience in the military, has a wealth of experience in making decisions, in understanding decision-making systems, always very thoughtful about the use of technology. One of the earliest actually users of Palantir in the UK military, if not the earliest. One of the first people to bring it in and realize how technology was going to change, that whole area. For me, I think the key thing about co-founder is interesting. You have to have, like, at the heart, a similar sort of belief system. And by that, I mean, like, both of us, you could talk to anyone across Electric Twin. We believe in this idea of agency, empowerment, about having great people and enabling them, that we should trust the people closest to the problem to solve the decision. That is completely true for me and Alex. We do have different working styles and we do have different skill sets. And so in some ways that difference is really valuable. He's far better qualified than me to build a great business, but I am better qualified to, build around synthetic audience and the technical details. That's what I desperately care about. He desperately cares about the organization. I think that combination together is really powerful. So I think it's about thinking about what are the differences that you need to make sure you have, but while we're making sure that on some core things, you're very much aligned.
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense. Find someone who you resonate with on a core level, the foundational values, principles you have as common, and then find your set of different strengths, different qualities that you bring to the table, and then maybe say, okay, these are the things that you are good at, these are the things that I'm good at, and then let's start building.
It's really interesting. Alex and I, this is before we even talked to investor, wrote a list, and it sort of has what Alex is doing, what I'm doing, what we're shared doing. And I don't think there is anything even, what probably now getting on for 3 years from that conversation, maybe 2.5 years from that conversation, anything's really changed on that list.
Wow. So that clarity is also very important.
Yeah. I think that maybe though, I would say, yes, that clarity is very important. And I think if we did have a problem within that, it would be very helpful. But I think actually that nothing's changed is proof that we're well matched in terms of what we do. If you see what I mean, like the fact that exercise was easy and stays is actually evidence of the fact that we are just nicely positioned in terms of our skill sets and what we care about, rather than evidence that that list is,
Right.
valuable.
Understood. So I think from our last episode, one of the viewers asked us whether we could question on where people go wrong in finding their co-founders. I think that serves as an answer to this question. Find people who you align with on a core level, then get your things separated, like understand what you're good at, probably make an Excel like you all did, and then work on that and just have open, honest communication with your co-founder.
Yeah, I think it's just very difficult. I think it's a strange one because, in some ways you spend as much time, if not more time, with your co-founder than you spend with your wife.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky one, but yeah, I think it is about that core values. I think sometimes also, like, if you're the person looking for the extra person, if you will, where you've sort of got an idea and you're looking for somebody, I think sometimes we have too much clarity on what we don't have clarity on. When I was a consultant at faculty, often companies would say, we'd want to bring you in because we don't really know what we're doing about AI. We'd say, great, we can help you with that. We know how to do this. And they'd say, great, come in. And then they'd say, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. Well, you don't know anything about AI, so why are you telling us what to do? That's a bit silly.
Exactly.
And so I think you have to be careful about that with like a co-founder, because you say, okay, I'm a technical person. I need a commercial person who does X, Y, Z. So I think it's important that, you think about what you can't do, but don't be overly specific in what you need the other person to be, because I think otherwise you're looking for sort of a unicorn, and you're not going to find a unicorn. What you're going to find is a horse with a constructor's head.
Exactly. That makes perfect sense. Just going a bit deeper onto team building, one of your core values is hire exceptionally. So, what does this break down into? You've now built a team of about 20 odd people. So, what are key skills that are probably deal makers for you? And similarly, some skills that are, or some qualities that might be deal breakers for you as well.
So deal breakers is just culture. They have to fit the electric twin culture. Great culture breeds a better culture. Bad culture breeds a bad culture. We make sure that founders are involved in the interview process. I think for us, one of the reasons what we really concentrate on when we're doing hiring is that we believe we're trying to recruit world-class people, and therefore we believe they have options. And therefore, in that interview process, it's as much about remembering that they're picking us as we're picking them. And I think making sure that when you're doing these interview processes, you maintain that. If you remember that, it keeps you having an honest conversation about the person, and a candid conversation about what the job actually represents, what it actually is. Because that's when I think you attract a really good talent. They actually know the job they're going to do and they're really excited about it, rather than somebody, if you spend too much time trying to sell somebody, or just, you don't reveal everything and just test them, then you don't find that nice match.
Right. Understood. That's, I think, very important for us as students at LBS as well, who are, trying to recruit in London. It's always important for us to remember that as important it is for the company that is picking us, it is important for us as well that we are picking the company, because if the cultures don't align, it does not bring out the best performance
100%.
from us as well. That is something that
So like one of the things I learned off Alex is he's really good at letting people ask questions. In fact, I've seen him do an interview where he just lets the other person ask questions. And in that conversation, they actually probably unveil much more information than they would if you went through tell me 3 times that you've, done X, Y, and Z. And I think it's a really powerful way of just building that rapport, finding that person's culture, learning about what motivates that person, what they're excited about, what they really care about. Because that's the really things that you're looking for when you're trying to recruit someone.
Right, understood. That is, I think, golden advice, especially for people like us who are, right now recruiting as well. But, moving forward, another important topic that has been surfaced by our viewers is fundraising. A lot of people here are building and they want to understand how to go about with investor pitches, how to go about with making decks. What are the things specifically that investors expect startups to have? And, from your experience, what do you think? How is it different from what founders feel investors want?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, so when I left Number 10 and I was thinking about what to do, at this point, Electric Twin is not even a kernel of an idea. I went and sat in the LightbuLBS deal flow meeting. Saul Klein was lucky and was nice enough to invite me, and it was a fascinating experience. Really, really, really interesting. And they were talking about all sorts of things, and some of them were about physics, about quantum that I'd done, or around climate change, and I'd worked on Number 10. And some of these ideas, I was like, they don't make sense. And I asked him afterwards, I was like, you didn't seem to spend much time being like, is the idea a good one? And he said, well, obviously that is important, but really what you're looking at is the people. You're investing in the talent. You're investing in, the people building the company. And I think sometimes we forget that at an early stage, when you think about, so LightbuLBS actually invested in Electric Twin, and what you think they actually invested in, it was a janky prototype and a PowerPoint deck. They're not actually investing in that. They're investing in, Alex, myself, what they think we can build, work together in partnership with them to get to that next level. And so I think sometimes that story about why you, specifically you, not the company, is the bit that we sometimes forget. These people are making quite a big bet in you. They're going to give you money and then you could just piss off. I'm actually not sure if we'd have just said, all right, Alex, you take 1.5, I'll take the other half. See you back at the local Globe meeting where we'll just tell them we've been on the beach. I don't know if they could have done anything. They probably could, but I genuinely don't know. So they're trusting you with large sums of money. So I think it's about that. Like, how do you build that trust in the investor that you genuinely care, you'll genuinely go after this, you'll really sort of fight hard on this really difficult problem. And I think building that trust in the investor. So I think sometimes, if you go at it from a sort of just fast talking, fast speaking, that sort of sales style of things, that won't work. But they also want to see that you can reach them, you can interact with them, because the skills that you use to persuade a VC are the skills you're going to need to get to an enterprise client.
Exactly.
And so there's all these trade-offs. And I think thinking about that, like, how are you representing yourself as a founding team to those early stage investors is worth thinking about, as well as the sort of story of your company and all the stuff around the pitch deck, etc.
Understood. Because I think a lot of people here also feel when you're going to a VC, my idea is not that developed that I can give them an answer to everything. I'm still at a very early stage. It's much more about you as the founder than you think.
Yes, I'd agree with that, but I think you do want to try and make sure you've got an answer.
Yeah.
I think actually being able to think deeply about a problem, being able to ask their question, well, if you can just say, well, when I talk to this customer or when I talk to this person, I think those sort of things build the credibility, because those are exactly the skills that you're going to need when you're actually building a product.
All right. And do you have any advice for students or, first time founders who are thinking about raising capital, be it around choosing the type of investor or maybe around choosing the type of deal structure that they can look at? Any sort of advice?
Investors, choose wisely. Don't get obsessed with arbitrary, valuations and things like this. Your investors are an incredibly valuable asset. Our investors have been hugely supportive. They have been a phenomenal asset for us, but for some founders, I think that isn't quite as true. They're intrusive or they get in the way, etc. And I think it's because we're lucky enough to have very, very good money. So if you have the choice between excellent money, a lower valuation, and dumb money, a high valuation, choose the good money every time. Choose the best investors. Investor is more important than valuation.
Right. Understood. That is something that will probably be a key takeaway from our fundraising section of the podcast. Just moving ahead about Electric Twin and its vision and mission in the future. What are your some goals that you might want to achieve in the next 2 to 3 years with Electric Twin?
With every startup, I feel like there's certain milestones. There's like
Mm.
getting your first paying customer, which we've managed to do. Then there's about building out a product that you can shows real value in an enterprise, and that's what we've attained recently. And then it's about being able to sort of scale that. So obviously we're starting to think about going to the US and these other places. And I think the really exciting thing for us over the next couple of years is really demonstrating the impact, demonstrating that actually with these new tools, these new ways of thinking, we can help companies make better decisions, organizations make better decisions, start thinking about how we can support government as it starts to think about some of the really big challenges, energy being a classic one in the UK, like what should we do with our energy system? How can we build out a very, way of moving that forward? And all the big problems of that. So I think for us, the impact that Electric Twin can have on the world is the most, important thing over the next couple of years.
Right. Just out of curiosity, right now, like you mentioned, you're very much focused with the large enterprises. But do you think somewhere down the line you'd want to be accessible to the small and medium businesses as well? Something that they can use maybe somewhat on a daily basis? Right.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. I think at the moment we're really focused. I think one of the things that you have to be as a startup is you have to be really focused on who your customer is. And although it's easy to be like, we'll sell to everyone, focus on these are the specific companies, these are the specific customers within that product, and then over time widen out. And the way I think we will end up doing that is based on our science experiments and the problems that we can solve. So, for instance, the reason why at the moment we can't solve to small companies is because they just don't have access to the data that allows us to build accurate synthetic audiences. However, we might be able to solve that problem, and so then we can solve to that, to sell to that set of companies. But also for some small companies, they just don't have money to do market research. Actually, the best way for some small startups to get the market research is try and sell your product. And in trying to sell your product, you get the research. Do people like it or not?
Do a lot of these SMEs or startups reach out to you? Are you looking for your subs? Because I was working for a startup back in India called Dr. Water, who purchased from China, sell to the US, and majority of the business was really focused on addressing their market, making sure their ads and the content that they predict reach the right people. It makes them click purchase and they have to. Do a lot of these startups reach out to you because I can see the use case for it in them?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One is Startups do, we just have to focus and we can't quite solve their problems. The other thing, as you've just mentioned there, actually, when you think about actually the feedback loop that they're getting from their efforts is really valuable. So that provides them with a really, quite a decent insight into the problem. So for electric twin, we are better off when your feedback loops are much slower, more costly, or you can't do them in the open. So that pulls you back towards big brands. Like Nike launching, and let's say Apple launches something in shit, everyone judges them. A startup launches something in shit, cares. If a product launches a forest and nobody notices, did it really launch? Apple people launch. So that's why I think we end up being pulled towards enterprise where brand equity matters and things like this.
Yeah, that makes sense. They have a lot more at stake in that sense. And I was just thinking of it from a use case perspective. But of course, startup do have that kind of case. Even at the company that I was working for, we would pull out data from every possible source of feedback. So apart from the feedback that we get from your customers, seeing the comments and try to understand what this sort of sentiment analysis we did in the comments of our post to see, okay, do they actually like the product? The feedback consistent with what we heard, even from DMs that we got on Instagram. We were trying to really see what that's saying because our founder was Indian and we're again trying to sell to Americans. There was one case where the founder personally called a customer, asked about any issue they faced, and the customer's response was, "You're a scammer. You're calling you sound too Indian to be the founder."
That's what I think this type of tooling is really useful when you're trying to understand different cultures. And it's really interesting. So one of Local Globe introduced us to one of their LPs who I believe either helped set up, she did a lot of market research as a lot of the big brands came into India. So like Unilever and stuff. They actually just told this story about I think it was Mercedes or BMW. They're like, why is our car not selling? And she just went over and looked at it. It's like your air conditions at the front. Now, obviously, in India, if you have a BMW or a Mercedes, we're sitting in the back. And so I think learning those sort of things and those things, I think there's some really interesting things as we think about those type of different cultures. That most people are, I think we forget, although we are all very similar, actually different cultures are actually quite different at different times and how they view different things and how they think about different things. The classic difference being China, red is good, green is bad.
Yeah.
In the UK, red is green, bad, green is green. And people just don't realize, most people aren't aware of all these cultural differences. And so tools like this, I think, can help for that sort of stuff. Fundamentally, actually, got to do with that sort of stuff. The best way of solving it is just have somebody who actually is from that culture. So there's lots of interest. There's lots of really interesting sort of next use cases that we could explore. But right now, it's just all hands to the wheel to make sure that we neck this single use case, this single SCP, and then we can, basically the way I always think about it is that, you have to buy the ticket, you have to build up enough sort of resources that you can do the next thing, and you just got to pay the costs at each level. And so you can, there's all sorts of wonderful ideas that you could do. I actually just got to focus on we just got to pay the cost of this for get to this next thing. Buys it's a ticket to do the next thing.
That's fair. Yeah, there's always some opportunity cost involved where working on it. How did you get this sort of focus? How do you decide that these are just these people I'm catering to and the others are my opportunity cost?
The constraints of our platform and where our science was, the early opportunities, and then just sort of like thinking through and sort of custom feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically early customers and constraints of our platform.
That's very experience based. Do you think that this is just an idea because we were co-founders of on an AI based interview prep platform, you know, just we recently given our stopped operation today. But that is where I think we always face an issue of really understanding what one type of persona or customer do we pick. And I guess you're right that just comes from experience. There's no flow chart for it that we
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. One thing that always makes me laugh is people say in the startup, you should always focus and you should always be experimenting. Those two things are not the same. And that's one of the reasons why when you asked me about failure, I was like, I don't really like that. I get there. I'm like, it's not, I think, and so I think the best way to describe that is your experimentation and your focus have to be aligned, working together. Yay. And that's the thing with an A-stage startup, be honest answer is you have to take bets and just sometimes we get lucky. I mean, who knows? We could have chosen the wrong one. We could have
we should have chosen a generalist audience and we missed it. And actually, in 2 years' time, I'll be like,
I was wondering because the type of consumers in let's say synthetic audiences will also differ from the type of industry or the type of clients that you have. Like say if you are going to Unilever, they want end consumers who think differently. But you might go to an oil and gas manufacturer whose consumers are other large scale businesses who think differently. So is was that a challenge, trying to emulate different types of consumer thinking?
most of the work we do at the moment is B2C. We do some B2B and we do get accurate results in B2B, but most of what we do is B2C. B2B is just much more expensive to get the good data.
Right, because they don't have the volume.
It's harder to find the people to interview them.
Well, this has been very interesting, Ben. Moving to the last section, it's a rapid fire round. I just want to ask you a series of questions and just blurt out what comes to you naturally. Are you ready to start?
Yeah.
Okay. One trait every founder must have:
I'm going to say bounce back ability.
bounce back ability. Wow.
Well, just when, things go wrong, whatever you hope people will, things you think will be massively successful on and things that, things won't work out and you just have to be able to just take it in your stride and go again.
Right. One resource, anything, a book, a series, or a podcast that has strongly influenced you.
I love the book Secrets of Our Success by Joe Heinrich. I think it's a really, really good model on how human behavior actually is driven by culture and the cultures that we sit within.
Right. Best piece of advice you got while starting out.
So I was talking to Andy Brooks, the CTO of Faculty, and I was talking to him about all the stuff we were doing, and we were using our tool to help do some really cool projects in the US with some really interesting companies. And he goes, "Is it to do with the product?" And I was like, "Well," and he's like, "If it's not to do with your product, don't fucking do it." Software companies are hard to build. Product companies are hard to build. It is easier to wrap services. It is easier. There's always ways that you can, if you're a smart, intelligent person, you will be able to find work and people to buy your service. Building a product is not that. Building a product is something that is scalable without you. That's hard. And I think it's very easy to chase revenue and see revenue and all this sort of stuff. But if it's not your product, why the fuck are you doing it?
True. And lastly, one thing you would want every founder or builder to keep in mind while starting out.
I think the thing I'd say is it's really important that you realize it's hard. I think if you're the person who finds doing it joyous, then that's great. In the same way that like some people love marathons and cycling and, these are not what you would necessarily call fun activities, but people enjoy it. And I think startups are like that. And so I think, but just giving yourself the accepting that it is hard. And sometimes, you're like, fucking hell, like deep breath. That's why I think having a co-founder, like, it's really nice sometimes you just take a deep breath, have a beer, because one of you will be doing well, ups and downs. But then also, you suddenly look back and you see how far you've come, and that's amazing.
Right. Understood. Well, with that, I come to the end of all the questions I've had. Ben, this was a fantastic conversation. I've loved, learning more about how you're building, and we'll surely be looking at how Electric Twin evolves in the next couple
Thank you
of
so
years.
much. It's been an
Thank you
absolute
so
pleasure.
much for joining us at London Business School.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.